Welcome back. It is now time for the special interview here on BEFM Busan 영어 방송. This nation of Cambodia has been swept up in a controversial election. The Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen's party, the Cambodian People's Party, has declared a landslide victory in their general election, claiming 80% of the votes. However, this election is being called a sham by many in the country as well as some outside observers. The leading party's now dissolved opposition leader called this, quote, a victory without a consent is a hollow one, end quote. In today's special interview, we'll be discussing this matter with one of the leaders in the Cambodian political studies. We have Professor Sophal on the line with us. He is the Associate Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College. Hello, Professor.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, good. Thank you for joining us. So let's get right to this controversial election. So, polling has now ended and the Cambodian People's Party has declared itself a victory, but it is being called a sham, a not a fair and free election. Can you walk us through why that is?
Well, the Cambodian People's Party, the ruling party, essentially arranged for its own competitors. It removed certain competitors, and primarily the Cambodian National Rescue Party, which won nearly half the vote in 2013 and in commune elections in 2017. From that, the Cambodian People's Party decided to attack the two main English-language newspapers in Cambodia, expel the National Democratic Institute, which observes elections locally, and the Radio Free Asia, which broadcasts independent news into Cambodia, aside from, of course, jailing the president of CNRP and dissolving the CNRP itself.
Right, so let's get to the details of these issues. So one of the biggest criticisms of this election was that there was basically no opposition. If I'm correct, there were 19 other parties on the ballot, but none was a serious contender as, like you mentioned, the Cambodia National Rescue Party, its biggest opposition, had been... Oh, I'm sorry. We are having some connection issues with Professor Sophal. We are trying to reconnect with him right now, but just to give you a wrap-up of our interview on what he has spoken so far, yes, we are talking about this controversial Cambodian election where the very long-term ruling, since let me check on the numbers, but the Prime Minister Hun Sen and his ruling party, the Cambodia People's Party, declared a win, an 80% win of all the votes. However, there are now reports being made about, like our experts said, about possible jailment of even some political opposition. So I think we have our professor back on the air. Hello.
Yes, I'm sorry. We were cut off.
Oh, no. It is what happens in live interviews. But let's go right back to where we left off. We were just discussing the Cambodian National Rescue Party and how it was dissolved. So what were the circumstances surrounding this opposition party's dismantling?
The CNRP was dismantled on the basis of its president having made a speech which was recorded in 2013 in Australia and was on YouTube for a number of years without apparently anyone complaining about it, in which the president of CNRP, Kem Sokha, says that he receives technical assistance, advice from professors in Canada and elsewhere. And that was taken as apparently treason to get advice from professors outside your own country about how to, run a campaign.
Right.
Of course, that is ludicrous, and that is what a party that desires to shape its own election without competition would do.
I see. So yes, these grounds were, shaky at best. And during the campaign, opposition activists called for, a voter boycott, and they had been accused of incitement. So what other attempts were there to allegedly quash the opposition? You covered a few, but I heard that these attempts to intimidate voters even were very strong, especially in rural areas. So can you get into more detail of that?
Absolutely. The understanding I have of what happened there is pretty much forcing people to sign up into the CPP, the Cambodian People's Party family, which sounds almost like a mafia-like agreement to essentially support the party when election time comes around. And, of course, threats that if you didn't go to vote and apparently vote the way that was expected of you, your province, for example, Ratanakiri province, would not receive support anymore from the government, so that it would essentially abandon its own people when they are citizens. That is totally contrary to the idea of citizenship, whereby your political rights are guaranteed.
I see. So, but as a follow-up, was there any opposition to these attempts by the government?
During all of this, the Clean Finger campaign was launched by the opposition to essentially boycott the election. So that, if you go vote in Cambodia, you have to dip your finger into this indelible ink that will essentially mark you as having voted. Well, they said you should have clean fingers and not take part in this election. And apparently in the capital city, at least, quite a few clean fingers were around because it was very quiet. And despite the 82% voter turnout, which nobody can prove one way or the other because there was no independent monitoring, only biased monitoring, that would still result in 1.5 million people not voting, despite all these threats against them. So, unfortunately, I tend to think that there are a few countries in the world, perhaps one neighboring South Korea, that would exercise this kind of outrageous behavior on its citizens.
And, it is hard to imagine that in a, quote, democratic election. And speaking of which, the country has had free elections since 1993. And this, I believe, was the sixth one in history. And how has this election, fared compared to those of the past? And you just mentioned that there were no outside independent monitors.
Right. So at least in previous elections, non-governmental organizations like the National Democratic Institute would have been able to monitor and to report during election day. But elections are the culmination of the democratic process. It's not as if you just hold an election and you have democracy.
Right.
You have to make sure that before the election things are fair for everybody, and that you're allowed to actually compete, and you have a freedom of expression and free media, so that they can report on things. Well, they were telling the press that asking questions about people's who they supported or why they supported this party or that was illegal before the election, and so it was clearly a message to the independent media to stick their noses elsewhere and not ask questions about this. On election day itself, the Minister of Information was caught by Australia Broadcast Corporation Television handing $200 to reporters, and he actually said that you guys are here, so I can't give them the money. And then 15 minutes later, he was filmed giving them the money. And it's why. It's because he needed them to report on the election in a way that favored the Cambodian People's Party, made sure that it looked legitimate and not what it in fact is, which is completely illegitimate and a farce, a mockery of democracy.
Right, I see. And I want to address this figure, this man behind all of this controversy, the Prime Minister Hun Sen. He has apparently ruled the country for 33 years. And what is the general reputation of the Prime Minister within the country, of course, and even in the international community?
Within the country, he, I think, elicits fear in people. His style of governance is to threaten. He's, in fact, made veiled threats with respect to myself, having said that I should leave the United States, for example. It's really quite surprising that a world leader such as himself would engage in this kind of behavior. Internationally, I can tell you that before the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit in March of this year, he apparently was displeased with some protests taking place in Australia and elsewhere, burning his image in effigy. I think protests tend to do that. And he said that he would personally beat up anyone who did that, as in literally go to their homes and beat them up. Now, of course, he meant that perhaps in terms of sending somebody to beat them up. But that is completely outrageous. I mean, first of all, you have a sovereign country in Australia. You have Cambodians living in Australia who are Australian citizens. They have the freedom to protest. They should not be intimidated in this way. This is the kind of behavior that one would have witnessed, I think, in the Gwangju uprising, where there was a huge crackdown. This is not acceptable in my view.
Yes, especially in this day and age. And I do want to clarify that one point, that you yourself personally have received threats from, Prime Minister Hun Sen or his side about your...
Yes, absolutely. He made a speech in December of 2016 in which he, of all things, I was criticizing Donald Trump as being autocratic and bordering on dictatorial, and Hun Sen had sided with Trump in terms of wanting him to get elected. And then when Trump was elected, he then did a little victory round and made a speech in which he called me out and said that I should leave the United States now that Trump won. As well as he knew more about diplomacy, given that he was Minister of Foreign Affairs since age 25. That, of course, is completely... who needs to talk about these things? But I'm merely a professor here, and that's all I am.
Right. Personal politics, political views aside, that is, almost unbelievable for, like you said, an individual academic to receive comments from a government. But leaving that story for now, looking at this election from the view of outside parties, the U.S. and the European Union have both given significant amounts of aid to Cambodia since 1993. But they are also apparently questioning the credibility of the election. So what have these bodies said or done about the election?
Well, the White House immediately issued a press release in which it called for increased sanctions on Cambodia's leaders, primarily at this point targeted sanctions of the visa nature. But I believe that the House of Representatives has passed a bill called the Cambodia Democracy Act, naming individuals it wishes to sanction beyond visas in terms of asset freezes, banking, and so on. And so already one individual, the Prime Minister's bodyguard chief, has been named as a Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Specially Designated National, meaning he is now blacklisted. He cannot bank in the United States or basically anywhere, because all other banks correspond with banks in the United States for transfers and such, and he cannot hold assets. His assets will be frozen.
I see. And do you think...
I'm sorry, and beyond that, the European Union has also issued its own statements of concern, and there is possibility of everything but arms, the preferential trade agreement to which Cambodia qualifies, being suspended, which would cause close to $700 million in increased tariffs on Cambodia.
I see. And with that, our final question. So all things considered, these EU and US pressures and other outside opinions, where do you think democracy in Cambodia is heading towards?
I think that Cambodia democracy is at its nadir at this point, in terms of having suffered its worst losses, its worst setback. It's been 25 years of not something necessarily beautiful, but it was at least better than what we have now. So we've gone backwards to the point where I think we're back to 1992, prior to the United Nations holding an election in Cambodia. The future in terms of Cambodian democracy, I think is still one that I have to be optimistic about. After all, every country that has suffered at the hands of leaders who abused power, who took advantage of their people, eventually things have got to change. Eventually, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and I believe that in the future, Cambodian democracy will be stronger. It's just a matter of time, and despite the fact that we've seen this huge setback, we are going to see the aspirations of the Cambodian people re-emerge, if not within the next 5 years. I'm certain that it will happen sooner or later, because that is how people should be. They should have a say in how their country is run. They should have a say in who leads them as a people.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for your incredible personal story as well as your professional insights. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for this.
Bye-bye. Yes, once again, it was Professor Sophal here, the Associate Professor of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College, discussing the controversial Cambodian election. Let's move on to our next song. It is Loving the Sound by the Overtones.